Okay, so now we have our basic anchor loops created. They're fluent, they are clean, our feeding loops. It's time to put our loopy training into action. So we do this by growing the loop. So think of your loop, click feed. Now we're going to stretch it out and we're going to ask for a behavior into that loop. So we're going to cue a behavior, wait for the dog to give us the behavior, and then we click feed. Cue, behavior, click feed. So we've just grown our little loop a little bit bigger and inserted a behavior. So for instance, let's say we can do a down, like the lovely down that we saw with Desiree doing earlier, where I was just asking her to lie down, stand up, lie down, stand up, lie down. So I cue her to down, she does the down, I mark, I feed, and I feed in such a way as to bring her back to the original position so she can down again. And that creates my nice clean loop. Now let's take a look at what this, how this plays out in practice. So here we have Griffin. He is also doing a down loop where he's lying down. I actually feed him in the down position and then bring him back to standing to complete the loop, and feed him again up there, and we do a loop that way. So let's take a look at this. We have a nice clean loop. He goes back to stand. So then once we have that clean loop, again, that becomes the anchor. So the feeding loop was originally the anchor, and then now I've created a new anchor loop, which is the nice little simple clean down loop. And from there I can start to add complexity. So what is my complexity that I'm trying to add here? Well, I eventually want my dog to be able to down with me be standing behind him, because he is going to be a sheepdog and I need him to be able to down while looking away from me. So at this point, the first thing I did was I taught him the pattern of doing a down very cleanly in a nice clean loop like you see here. And then now I'm going to start to grow the criteria with every step by moving a little bit around him until I'm further and further behind him. Meanwhile, I'm maintaining the clean loop. So as long as he can keep the clean loop, remember when we have a clean loop, we can move to the next step of our criteria. And not only can we should. So watch how quickly I am growing my criteria, but very small steps, and I'm maintaining the clean loop as I go. So I'm moving around him. So I started in front, now I'm moving to the side. And he's not having any trouble with that because I'm just keeping that pattern of the clean loop that he's so familiar with. This is also a pattern game. And then I'm moving behind him. So you can see I've gone from standing in front of him to standing beside him in one training session in 4 repetitions, and he had kept perfect clean criteria the whole time. So this is what we're looking for, ideally, is to maintain that clean loop so that we know that our dog is understanding what we're asking as we change the criteria. So as we grow our training, it's really important to keep in mind each step of our criteria. So we have a plan. So the video I just showed, I had a plan of how I was going to move from being in front of my dog to being beside my dog, and then I would eventually grow to be able to be behind him at a future training session. So I keep my sessions short and I grow my loops as you just saw. So the end behavior is what I'm aiming towards, and I have a planned set of steps in my mind of what criteria to go through to get to that end behavior. So that's the way we progress our training loops. Now, once we get to the point where we have the end behavior, then we can start to grow the complexity even further by changing the context. So we now have a really nice, let's say I've got a nice clean loop of Griffin being able to down with me standing behind him. Now I can start to add distance, duration, distraction, change the location, and increase the stimulating environment that he's in. And all of that are ways that I can add to the complexity of the loop, but I have it nice and clean, and I maintain that clean loop the whole way along by gradually increasing criteria and noticing that if the loop starts to break down at any point, then I have information that tells me that I need to step back a little bit and fix things before moving forward. Let's now take a look at how we can use Loopy training to teach backup.
Vivian is 5.5 months old. She knows a couple of location-specific markers, search and take it. She knows what the clicker is, and that's the only training I've done with her. She's never actually seen a mat before. I've never done this exercise with her before, and I'm just working on building a clean loop to have her do a backup, which is not necessarily something you would start training a young puppy doing right off the bat, but here's how you can do it with Loopy training. So adjust the mat. So this session is a little messy because I'm trying to get to the clean loop. Notice that I'm not starting there. I'm working towards it. I have to make some adjustments in my setup, my reward placement, but we've already got to back up to the mat. Adjust myself because I'm not getting actual foot movement there. I'll use a cookie just to help her get back into a position I like better. Lots of cookies. High rate of reinforcement. Keen little worker. So now I'm getting consistent steps back. Now's a clean loop. 3 or 4 reps of a clean loop.
All right, so you can see how very quickly I achieved, I was able to get Vivian to do this clean loop of just eat and step back, eat and step back, eat and step back. And so now what I would do next, and I can't in this little tiny tight corner that I'm training in, so I end the session here. But what I would do to grow this behavior is all I would have to do is start to take a step backwards and just keep that loop where growing in small steps where I step back and then repeat what we're doing. And then I step a little further back and repeat what we're doing. And as long as the loop stays clean, as long as she eats and then immediately lifts up her head and walks backwards and stops on the mat, then I have a clean loop. I can keep growing the behavior. And if I get to a point where that starts to fall apart, then I know I've gone too far and I step it back. So again, the rule of Loopy training is if you get the clean loop, you move forward. And so if I have a clean repetition once or twice in a row, certainly no more than 3 times, I want to then move on. And but on the flip side, if the behavior breaks down and I see some junk behavior come in, after I might repeat it twice. But certainly if it happens 2 times in a row, I immediately step back my criteria, or I end the session and try and figure out what's going on. So the Loopy training, training approach to building this behavior or any behavior will show up immediately when we start to have things fall apart. Rather than have them fall apart in a big way, we see the little subtle changes as we go. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Now let's look at Loopy training to build a more complicated behavior, specifically lateral stepping. Now this is actually quite a tricky thing to train, to get your dog to basically walk sideways. And we can use Loopy training to build this. How do we do that? Well, we want to break it down into little pieces and train the pieces separately. This is called the constructivist approach to training. And the way we would do this is or the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to demonstrate here, is first of all, I'm going to teach my dog to do a chin rest. I want her to put my hand, her chin in my hand, and then I want to, so that would be one loop. And then the next loop is I want to teach her how to keep her chin in my hand while I move my hand around. So those 2 loops become, so the first loop is my anchor loop, and then I grow that anchor loop to be able to include the movement of my hand. From there, I can then get the dog to move around with her head in my hand, and so I can build a more complicated behavior chain. So for instance, for sidestep, what I would do is I would also build as a completely separate loop, having my dog come and stand on a mat. So I have the chin rest behavior, I have the follow the chin behavior, both of them taught with clean loops. And then I also have a stand on the mat behavior taught separately with another clean loop. Then I can start putting things together. So then I have my chin rest on a mat. Can you come onto the mat and do a chin rest? And if that is the case, can you come onto the mat and do a chin rest and do movement? So then I've now combined the three pieces, those three loops, into one complete loop. And as long as it stays clean, as long as I don't see junk behavior, as long as I don't see things breaking down, I can progress. So then the next step is to do the loop of the chin rest on the mat with movement. And can you step to a second mat? And that gives us our lateral steps. So let me show you this in practice. Okay, here comes Des. She does her chin rest on a mat. I've dropped a cookie. Okay, we reset. We had a little bit of junk behavior there. She comes in, nice and clean. Okay, and I'm just going to show you. So there was a little bit of junk behavior in there still, but we're getting closer to our clean loop. Remember, we don't necessarily start there. We work towards it. So what's going on here? Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, Desiree is not standing fully on the mat. She's got her front feet are off the mat. She's also a little bit crooked on the mat. Now, I've pulled her that way, so that's part of that is my mechanics. I'm probably walking in such a way that I pull her forward. Another thing to pay attention to is that there is a treat bowl on the couch there, and that's acting as a little bit of a magnet for her too. And also, look where I'm feeding to pull her off the mat. So we can look at, again, using the loopy training concept, this loop of her going onto the mat has broken down a little bit here. So I could clean this up very nicely by going back to doing a little bit of mat loop training and get her to be really clear on the criteria of you're supposed to have all 4 feet on the mat. I've rushed the training here a little bit and it shows. So this is a perfect example of how loopy training helps us problem solve. If I wasn't breaking things down this way, what I would have is a dog who maybe does lateral steps in a very kind of a sloppy way on a bit of a diagonal instead of in a real lateral. But I can see very clearly why, and I also know exactly what to do about it here. So let's just watch her do another repetition. Come in.
Nice, good girl.
So I was a little bit better with my mechanics there. I'm still, the way I'm feeding is still, you can see her face is still pulling towards the bowl. So there are things that can still be cleaned up here, but I can see very clearly what they are and how to do it. And we also have a dog who's doing very nice lateral steps. This is, I think, our very first session ever, and I think it looks pretty good. So again, the loopy training gives us a way to think about and plan our training, to break it down, and then to evaluate each piece and get the pieces very clearly explained to our dogs so they can do them. And then we start putting them together. So we use our anchor behaviors to build, and then we grow and expand, and we can create quite complex behaviors very quickly. Now, I promised to share how I use loopy training in herding, and so here's an example of me doing exactly that. What I've got here going is I want to teach my dog Lily, she's a Kelpie, here to go around and handle the pressure of the sheep in the corner. If you're not a herding person, don't worry about the terms that I'm using, but because it doesn't really matter. What matters here is how I'm using a loop in a very kind of messy context. Herding is very, very messy, but we can still use clean loops. So here I've got the sheep in a corner of the fence, and I want, Lily doesn't like working in a lot of pressure. So what I can do here is help her get comfortable with pressure by having her come in and pull the sheep out of the corner. And what she does is she goes around in a circle and then she'll come back to this same place. And that creates this nice pattern, this nice loop that can allow her to get more comfortable, and we can repeat it a few times. So let's take a look at what this looks like in action. So I call her forward, and then I send her around the sheep. The sheep follow me, so it allows me to create that little gap. So you see how there's a gap here between the fence and the sheep. That allows her to come in without being too uncomfortable the first time. And then I can have her come around, and then this time she doesn't quite come back in on the same spot, but the sheep have moved too. So then I call her in, she turns around and goes the other way. And she comes in, and now she's back at the start. So this is a clean loop right here. She's well, it's not, the loop isn't completely clean, but it's a complete loop. So she comes around. Now here's what's sort of fun about this is, so she came around and she went between the sheep, and as you saw, I move out and the sheep follow me, because I create a bit of a vacuum, allow the sheep to move out, and that allows her to move in, and she does this loop. So I can do this 2 or 3 times, where she goes around and she has this nice, happy experience that feels really good. And then what happens is I start to not move out as much. So I keep the sheep more in the corner, and I can gradually keep the sheep closer and closer into the corner. So she has to come into a tighter and tighter gap between the sheep and the fence, gradually growing her ability to handle the pressure through doing these loops. So this is just one example of how I use loopy training in herding, and it's very powerful and very helpful. Before we wrap up, because we're coming up on the end of our time together, there's one more concept that is really crucial and possibly the most important concept that I want to share with you about loopy training. And that is the notion of white space. So what is white space? White space is the little gap between when we cue and when our dogs do behavior. When our dog does the behavior and when we click. When we click and when we deliver reinforcement. And when our dog finishes eating their cookie, and when we cue again. There's always this little gap, this little moment of suspension between these events because of mechanics. We just don't have instantaneous. When I cue my dog to sit, they have to process the word before they start into action. And they can sit very quickly and respond very fast, but there's still going to be a tiny little gap. And what we want to pay attention to is what happens in those gaps. What we want to see, ideally, is tiny little gaps where nothing happens. What we tend to see are gaps of varying sizes where maybe a bunch of things happen. We might see some junk behavior coming in. So let me give you an example. You say sit, and your dog, there's a little white space, and then your dog sits. And then you're about to click and your dog starts to lie down. And so that is a little bit of junk behavior between the behavior of sitting and the clicking. Or maybe you click and then your dog lies down before you give them the cookie. So these are things that you want to pay attention to, because when we have anything happening in the white space, then we have information about what we need to do next. The other thing that can happen with white space is it can be delayed. So you say sit and nothing happens for like a second or 2 seconds, and then finally your dog sits. So you have a big gap, even if the dog is not, well, technically they are doing something, they are just standing, they're not sitting. So whatever happens in the white space, if it's not just a tiny little gap, then we know that we have some work to do to address the gap and to clean up our training, clean up the loop, tighten things up. So I'm going to show you in practice one very clear example of how having a bit of extraneous behavior in the white space gives us very important information to pay attention to. So here we have Desiree once again working on her chin rest, and I want you to pay close attention to what happens.
We don't have any extraneous behaviors. nice and clean. Okay. So you can see how well she could do the behavior. Now, the next thing I start to do is I want to start moving her head, maintaining her contact of her chin in my hand as I move my hand, for eventually being able to move her around with it. And watch what happens. So I'm starting to add a little bit of movement to the chin rest. All right. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this, because this is how you tune your listening skills. I didn't see this when I, in action. I've learned to see this with Des, because she does it a lot. But look back here. I just want to show you. Watch her tongue. She does a very big lip lick. See that? Goes right up over her nose. That's a sign of a little bit of stress. So then watch what happens next. Give her cookie, and boom. Okay? So what does she do? She, whereas she was doing this perfect clean loop, I moved the criteria a little bit too far ahead. She was unclear. She didn't quite know what I wanted her to do when I started moving my hand. I moved it too far. I get a lip lick, and then the behavior loop gets broken. She goes and sniffs. So she's sniffing for, like, she turns. She's like, oh, look, a crumb. And that, if there is a crumb, it might have been an imaginary crumb, I don't know. It was there the whole time before when we were doing the perfect clean loops. But she suddenly had to go and investigate that spot on the table because I had moved my criteria ahead too quickly. And this is when I'm talking about white space, it's, sorry, I've got puppies. When I talk about white space, that when we start to see a breakdown in the white space like that, the breakdown of the loop, that is not just her not paying attention and so on and so forth. That is very, very important information. That is telling me I did too much, too fast, too soon, and I need to slow down and reduce my criteria. And this is where, when we don't listen to the dog, we start to end up with a lot of fallout in our training.
All right, let me just turn my camera on again here, because this is, as I said, probably the most important concept that I want you to take away from our time together tonight. So here's the deal. You'll recall from the beginning of our discussion that training, I argue, and I hope you're now convinced, is building a communication system. You are building a language with your dog. And communication is two ways. It's a two-way street. So when we build a communication system with our dog, we have to deliver the information that we need to speak to our dogs in a way that they can understand. And we do that with cues and reinforcement. However, again, it's a two-way street. We also need for them to be able to speak to us, and they speak to us in behavior. And we need to listen to their behavior. And I don't just mean the behaviors that we ask for. Importantly, we need to listen to the behaviors that they do that give us information about what they are thinking and how they are feeling. And not only do we need to listen, we need to hear. And that is where a lot of training breaks down. We are so focused on our agenda, we are so focused on the outcomes that we are trying to achieve, that we don't listen, and or even if we do listen, we don't hear. And so our dogs are trying to tell us things all the time with their behavior. So for instance, in that situation with Desiree, where suddenly she disconnected from me and started sniffing, and she went right back to training after that. So it was very, very momentary that she disconnected from me, but it was a very powerful moment to tell me too much, too fast. I'm confused. I don't know what you want. Slow down. And what happens when we don't pay attention to that? So I'll call that a whisper. She sort of whispered at me. She's like, I'm kind of confused. And she's a real trooper, so she came right back to train. But when we ignore the whispers, what happens is our dogs start to need to up the volume. And then they start to shout. And what does shouting look like? Well, it can look like barking. It can look like biting. It can look like spinning. It can look like being hyper-operant, like we saw with Holly. It can look like dogs that slow down, they get sniffy, they get sticky. It can look like dogs that look sad, that look like they don't enjoy their time with us. It can be dogs who quit on us completely and who don't want to train with us anymore. All of this comes from not listening, not hearing when they speak to us through the behavior, the language of behavior, which is how they communicate. And Loopy training gives us an incredibly powerful tool to see, to hear, to see and hear what they're saying to us and to listen. So when we apply the rules of Loopy training and we really pay attention and we watch for what happens in the white space and we watch for those clean loops and we pay attention to when the loops break down and we fix them on the go, little piece by little piece, what we do is we teach our dogs to trust us. We teach our dogs that they can speak and we will listen. They can whisper and we will listen. They don't have to shout. And when they feel that, what happens is then they feel heard. They feel understood. They feel confident. They feel safe in the training. And when we have confident, safe dogs who feel like true, genuine partners in the training instead of just the recipients of our agenda, we have dogs who will stay focused. They will stay engaged. We don't have to try and use arousal to get engagement because we have dogs that are naturally engaged because they're having fun. They're a partner in this. They think, yeah, this is awesome. We have dogs who will be fast because they are confident. They know exactly what to do. And best of all, we have dogs who stay in optimal arousal instead of an over-arousal. We avoid all of the fallout that we've been struggling with. It's all gone. And the best thing is that even if you have all of that, if you go and start doing Loopy training with your dog, all of that will disappear and you will get that happy, confident, focused, engaged partner that you seek. So that wraps up our time together. Once again, I really hope that understanding Loopy training will transform your training the way it has transformed mine. Importantly, it can help us problem solve where we have our challenges in our training. It will help us find better and new ways to train behaviors. As I've shown you, we can break down our behaviors into multiple small loops, train them out separately, and then put the pieces back together like a Lego set. We can plan our the training in very clear and strategic ways, paying attention to our criteria and using the rules of Loopy training to know when to move forward, when to move back. And as we proceed, we build a positive conditioned emotional response into the training instead of arousal problems like we were doing before. And best of all, we are keeping our dogs in a state of optimal arousal for optimal performance 100% of the time. Finally, here are a few additional resources that you can find on the web if you want to learn more about Loopy training. I hope this has whet your appetite, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and happy training.